Welcome to Playing with the Past. In this episode, Cole Werhle talks with my wargaming class at Clarkson University about game design and the production process. It's a fascinating talk. For those of you who don't know, Cole is the designer of Root, Oath, Pax Pamir, John Company, and the creative director at Leader Games and one of the co-owners of Whirligig Games. After he spoke to us, he went off to launch a new game on crowdfunding called Molly House, dealing with the history of early 18th century London and the queer spaces and policing. I hope you enjoy what you're about to hear and that you get as much out of it as I and my students did.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm always delighted to speak at classes, and it's fun to virtually visit you all at Clarkson. I hope the weather is as lovely there as it is here. Although, from my perspective, the classroom looks very dim, and I imagine you have no windows. So, what I would like to do is talk not too long, but a little bit to just both outline a little bit of my background. So this will be a careers talk in a small way, and then talk a little bit about the process of project initiation, design, and development. Now, and then after that, we can reserve a large section of time for questions. I'm happy to answer questions about pretty much anything. And for instance, if you'd like to know more about the business side of things, I can talk about that. Or if you want to talk more about the design side, we can do that, or upcoming projects or whatever you might like. So hold your questions, stew on them, and we will certainly get to them. Hi, it's very odd that I have the job I have. Not many people have it. I am creative director of this company called Leader Games, which is based in St. Paul, Minnesota. We have about 15 employees. And we're going to be growing probably. I think we're going to be going from 15 to like maybe 18 this year. And the company has been pretty healthy over the past few years because of Root, but also because of some other titles. And in my job, I manage the creative staff of the company and the allocation of all creative resources. So basically what being creative director means is that I get to help decide what games we publish. So I'm on the executive committee deciding what sorts of games we should work on. But the more important part of my job, and also the slightly more boring part, is the allocation of creative resources. So we call this something like creative services, which is, games need illustrators, they need editors, they need graphic designers, they need development teams and designers. And I get to play matchmaker and sort of project manager and make sure that every project gets to happen. We are, for instance, right now working on a pirate themed game that I spent yesterday in meetings making sure that they were going to have illustrators at the right time in order to complete their game. Now, I mention all that because games are like pretty much any other creative endeavor. We have producers who, do the kind of allocation work I'm talking about. We have principal creatives and we have support creatives on kind of any project. Now, the job that I have is a very odd thing. So I went to the University of Texas at Austin for my graduate work. I thought I wanted to be a professor. I was pretty convinced of it. And things had a funny way of not working out. And I have a lot to say about graduate school. I'll offer a very slight correction. I was technically cross-listed. So my PhD is in English, but half of my committee was from the history department, and my actual subject of my dissertation was much closer to history than it was to literary studies. And I was at the University of Texas for 6 or 7 years working on that project. And while I was doing that, I started publishing historical games, mostly on a lark. I was interested in them. I was trying to find excuses to teach myself how to do graphic design. So while I was working as a researcher at this place called the Digital Writing and Research Lab, they had lots of free classes in things like InDesign, Illustrator. They had access to lots of resources. And so whenever I had a little bit of extra fellowship time or scholarship time that I wasn't doing anything, I worked on designing kind of odd historical games. And what I found when I had completed my graduate work is that my historical games had done a lot better than my academic writing. I actually delayed the defense of my dissertation defense. And I went to my advisor and he asked me why in the world I would ever want to delay my dissertation defense. And I said, oh, I have to finish a game for Essen. And he was like, well, that's crazy. Your dissertation is obviously more important than the game. I said, well, I think more people are going to read the rule book to the game than will read the dissertation. And that was the tiebreaker. And I was, I finished that game. And then when I went on the job market, there were some jobs that I was competitive for. But as I was looking for academic jobs, there just so happened to be a job in the tabletop publishing industry, which I applied to and got. And then that job had me move my family up to Minnesota. and I was working on Root within about a week of starting this job. Um, the job, I could talk a lot about the history of Root, but I'll take it from a purely personal angle before I get into specifics of design. Um, Game companies are kind of funny things. The story of Leader Games is basically that it was started by a programmer who was also very bored at his job. You'll find many game companies start because someone doesn't like what they're doing and they want to do something else. And he had gotten very lucky. He had published a game called Vast: The Crystal Caverns, and it had done really well. And he had basically an extra $500,000 in the bank. Now that's a lot of money. You could buy a nice little lake house for $500,000. But you could also start a business. And he decided to, instead of buying the lake house, fund a few staff positions full time for a year. And so when I was first hired, it was a very weird hiring courtship dance we did, because he looked at me and said, I can't pay you very much money, and you have to know that the company is going to run out of money in about 8 months. And I said, well, that sounds great. I kind of want to move to Minnesota anyway. Even if it falls through, at least I'll be in a state that I wanted to be in. And so we all packed our bags and moved up to Minnesota. And in those first weeks, we had no idea what we were going to do. And the primary objective was to figure out how we could create a working business plan with our little staff. Now, one thing about working at a small business, for those of you who maybe haven't done that yet, one of the most important choices you'll make after you complete your studies is the place you want to work. And I've worked in lots of different places and in a lot of different industries, and I really find there's really only one essential difference, and the essential difference is size. Big businesses, big companies behave completely differently than small companies. And of course, there are other important factors, like, do you like the people you work with? That matters quite a bit. But at a small company, you are expected to do a lot more. And you are also going to be aware of the financial shape of that company. If the company has a good month, you will feel it. You're much it's like being in a low riding car. You're much closer to the road. You're going to feel every bump. At a big company, you might not hardly know why your labor helps the company generate value at all. And that's also, that's just, some people love that. But working at Leader, I definitely got very familiar with that. So we worked very hard that first year. And after about 10 months of labor, had physical copies of Root in our hands. Now, when I say work hard, I mean that quite literally. We didn't have money for staff computers. So most of us had our home computers at work, and we would all bike back into the office after we had put our kids to bed and whatnot, and work into the evening. We were in a rickety old warehouse. When it rained, we had to pop up umbrellas over our computers. And when the games finally arrived that summer, we all went down to the warehouse and packed every copy of Root that was shipped. And this was done because we just didn't have money to afford, outsourcing all of our shipping. And Root did really well, and it fundamentally changed the nature of the company. Pretty much overnight, we went from 4 employees to 8, and then from 8 to 12. And since then, we've been having kind of a steady growth in attrition. It's pretty normal for companies of that size. So that has been the kind of a button history of Leader. And the other thing that you should know on the same track is that while that happened, I also started publishing historical games with my brother. After watching the growth of Leader over the year, I learned a lot about how publishing works. I had never worked directly with a shipping company, for instance. And I remember taking the director of operations out to lunch and saying, well, how do you actually ship a box across the ocean? I've never done that before. Or not really a box, I'm talking about a shipping container. How do you do that? And he gave me some very good advice. And then I called up my brother, who was then a botanist at the Chicago Botanic Garden, or he worked in curriculum design. He worked for the Chicago Botanic Garden. And I said, well, I kind of want to start another board game company. Would you be interested in learning how to do the operations? Now, neither Drew or I is a business major. My brother Drew, I never took a class in the business school. But it turns out you don't need to do that to start a business. You just need to watch a lot of good YouTube videos, take careful notes, and get used to reading tax documents. So we started our historical game company, which works kind of alongside. Today, actually, right after this class, we'll be launching our next project. So you can tune in and see how well our next history game goes. Okay, so what I want to do then now that you've got a little sense of my background. So it's a little academic. I've been playing games for most of my life. Games have always mattered a lot to me. But the fact that I've ended up in this industry is mostly because I found that I was interested in games. And as opposed to saying, I would like to start working in games, I basically had the attitude of, I would like to learn how games are made, which means a lot of my first jobs in the game industry were not paid. I was just a volunteer. I was just trying to help. And my governing ethos during all that time was just make myself easy to work with. I want, if someone needs something, I will be happy to do it. And I won't ask a lot of questions, and I will just try to learn, be like a little sponge. And that has served me very, very well, because it has allowed me to come to understand a great deal of the industry and pick up a ton of skills, which when I got into the job market, it was immeasurably useful. Okay, so now what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we decide on projects at Leader Games and how we make the games that we make. So we have three broad rules for any project that we do at Leader Games. And everything I'm saying that's true of Leader Games is also true of Werhle Games. So the first rule is that the games that we work on have to have a project lead. Sorry, let me restate that. So first, the first thing is that we need to have the project lead has to be invested in the game. We are not interested in doing games unless the person directing the game cares about the game. Now, this seems like a really dumb rule. Like, why would you ever have someone lead a project who doesn't care about it? And yet you would be surprised at how often that happens. So it's a very easy rule for us to pass, but basically we just need to know that the team that's on the game really cares about it. Now, that means that, for instance, we decide our games broadly on it using a consensus formula. Now, consensus means that if any single member of the team objects, the game does not happen, no matter their position. And the exception to that is if the executive sort of wing of the company wants to overrule someone, they can, of course. They can say, look, I know you don't want to do it, but we have to do this thing. But that veto, that overruling, is used exceptionally sparingly. The default is everyone has to consent. Now, that means, despite the fact that I've published lots of games and worked on games, the first person I ask for permission is a customer service representative. And I go and tell them, here's the game I'm planning. What are your concerns from a customer service perspective? What can I say to make you excited about this potential project? As soon as I get their sign off, I go kind of the next rung up in the company to the sales reps. And then I go to the marketing reps. And then I go to the production reps. And I slowly have to get buy-in from every single person on the team, because I want the project we're working on. It's going to, a lot of times games take a year to 2 years to make. I need to make sure everyone is completely on board with that game before we go to it. So that's the project lead investment. The second thing that's important about titles for Leader Games is that we always look for player-driven narrative. So as a design ethos, we want to be giving players tools to assemble their own stories. We are not trying to collapse a television show into a piece of cardboard. We're not trying to design pre-scripted role-playing games or pre-scripted narrative games. I think that there's nothing wrong with those types of games, but it doesn't lean into our basic skill set. And the last thing that's important is there has to be project urgency. Now, at Leader Games, we have a way of defining this that is a little peculiar, which is basically a good Leader Games project needs to be very difficult for a small company. It needs to be too hard for a small company to have built, too complex for a small company to build, but also it needs to be too risky for a large company. So that the perfect Leader Games project is something that a large company would have been like, nope, we're not going to spend all this money doing this risky project. That's like condition one. And then condition two is a small company could have never marshaled the resources to do it. So for instance, we spent about 3 years working on a game called Oath, which is a generational political game where every end state is also the start state for the next game. It's a very odd game. It took a long time to make. It was very art intensive. And it's the kind of game that no small studio could have afforded to make, and no large studio would have been interested in making it. Whenever we're receiving pitches at conventions and things like that, if I have someone tell me that they have other publishers who are interested in their design, without missing a beat, I will tell them that they should sign their game with other publishers, because we're really only interested in the games that are having trouble getting signed, because those are places where we think our specific competitive advantages might be useful. Okay, so those are kind of like the rules of how we go about vetting every project. Now, where do the projects start? Well, projects start often in reaction to something. What we're particularly interested, I think everyone who works here, and certainly in my own design practice, I'm a very reactive designer. And I want to look for a type of game that is not a type of story that is not being well served by the current game environment. I also think about games as participating in a kind of conversation. They're in a dialectic. They're talking to other games. And the way they talk, the way that this conversation works is games are published, right? So we can chatter all we want, but ultimately, if you want to say something meaningful in the game space, one of the best things you can do is just make a game and put it into the game space and then watch other games respond to it. So I've been playing a lot, for instance, in the case of Root, a lot of this Eric Lang game called Blood Rage. It's a big, brawny Viking game. There's a lot of blood everywhere. And it's a very well-designed game, but it's also not really about anything in a way that it was a little disappointing. And I kept thinking about how, especially in the context of 2016, when I was working on Root in 2017, I was surprised at how many games were dressing themselves, kind of bedecking themselves in all of the symbols of war, but they weren't really engaged with the problems of conflict. And that was true on a thematic level, and it was also true on a mechanical level. And so I wanted to try to design a game that I felt like actually had something meaningful to say about conflict areas. And Root was the result of that investigation. Now, critically, I am not starting with a mechanical trick. Some designers do, and this is no shame. I'm not casting aspersions, but usually when I'm thinking about a game project, I start with the system, the interaction between the players. What kind of space am I going to put these players in that's going to, because I always think about games are essentially, they're like decision spaces. They're going to essentially adjudicate a winner. That's what a game is. And when I think about what a game space is, I think about it as like a cork board where I'm going to be putting players in these different spots, and then I'm going to be putting different tensions between those players. That doesn't say anything about what the game's mechanical framework is. Is it a roll and move game? Is it a negotiation game? Is it a bag builder, deck builder? It could be any of those things. But when I'm working on a game project, my primary goal is to just think about what is the feeling that I want the game to generate. Or the exercise that I use sometimes is, how do I want players to talk about the game when they're not playing it? And that can be a very good way of kind of triangulating what you want the feeling of the game to be. And then from that, I will design a set of mechanical systems to try to create those tensions. Now, once that kind of conceit is in place, we then go to a proof of concept stage where basically you spend a lot of your time trying to build the smallest, simplest, best version of a game. In this process, we pay a lot of attention to something that we call the iterative loop. The iterative loop is how quickly you go from playing a game to playing it again with changes. And so basically the way the iterative loop works is, for graphic design class, I draw it on the chalkboard, but I didn't prepare slides. The iterative loop basically says you play test, and then after you play test, you need to gather feedback, and then you need to decide what items are actionable. You need to put them into play. That means you might need to do some graphic design to get them in proper layout. That means you might need to do some print production. You got to go to the campus coffee shop and print things out, cut it up. Then you need to gather your playtesters. Then you need to play it again. And then you start the whole loop over again. When you are doing design work in the early stages of design, you want that iterative loop to be as tight as possible. You need to be able to react to a change immediately, which is why I usually tell people when they're starting in design to just use index cards and pencils. If you need to make a change to your game and you've got cards, just write it on the card and get to that next playtest as soon as you can. So the proof of concept stage can last a long time. And oftentimes the way the proof of concept stage ends is with a failed game. Usually I'll be working on a proof of concept and I'll realize, oh, this is not actually, the concept is not being proved right now. And so we will throw it in the bin, and then we start over and try a different approach. Now, eventually we will come across approach that appears to be working. And here is where we start thinking about a number of concerns. And so things that I usually ask myself are, to what degree am I prescribing the player's actions? I want the game spaces to be open. I want them to feel organic and responsive to the decisions of the players. So if I feel like I'm dictating strategy too much, or if there's only one way to play a particular faction, and in an asymmetric game such as Root, that's usually a bad sign. I want to be thinking about the open space. One of the other things that's really important is to think about the physical presentation of the game. Now, this is something that's sort of easy to forget in our own kind of digital world. Games are physical objects. They sit in a box. They require no software, no hardware apparatus to play. No hardware outside of the pieces in the box. One of my favorite things about games is that one could imagine them getting stuffed in a closet and being discovered in 50 years, and they should still work. I don't know if they're going to work in 100 years, but in 50 years, they should still work, which is more than I could say for some of my old Game Boy games. And so there is a half-life to the ideas in games, especially in tabletop games, that is quite considerable. And so for that reason, I tend to spend a lot of time thinking about what games demand as physical objects. Now, when I was working on Oath, I spent a lot of time measuring tables. And I did this because I knew that Oath was going to be played on tables, most games are, but also there's a common table. It's actually not so different from the table behind me, this is just a regular dining room table. I actually found this on the side of the road while I was walking to work one day, and I decided to drag it in. I took off the legs first. When you're working with a table, if you're thinking about making a game, one of the things you always want to start with is measuring a table and then figuring out how much space your game is going to be taking up. And actually, I just use sheets of paper, just 8.5 by 11 sheets of letter paper. And I will put it out on the board, on the table to make a board. And I'll say, okay, this is a 4-panel board, roughly 4 pieces of letter paper. This is a 6-panel board. And then every player area gets a sheet of paper. And by the way, if you've seen a copy of Root, you will find that most of the components are the size of a US letter piece of paper. But this allows me to very easily block out the table space. Now, as we start working on the game, we will realize that the game is presenting demands on the physical space. So for instance, in my game, John Company is a negotiation game. And player areas can be a little bit bigger than a Root player area. They can get a little sprawly because you've got all these assets you're holding on to. But also, I need to be able to like reach over and point at things in your player area. You need to be able to reach over and point at things in my player area. So I realized that the board in John Company, which is the same area as the board in Root, but has a different orientation. In Root, every panel is in portrait. And in John, which creates kind of a squarish board. And in John Company, every panel is in landscape, which creates a longer rectangular board. And that allows the player areas to extend into the table. It makes it much easier for players to reach over the entire board and point at things in other player areas. So that's a very low level kind of nitty gritty example of some of the design process, but really it's a reflection of a much larger ethos, which is just to recognize the degree to which games are objects. Now, I could go into this for a long time, and I'll only give one more small example, and then I'll talk about some design concerns. So when we were working on PAX Premier, my brother and I were studying a lot of Punjabi and Persian courtly games. Things like essentially the forerunners of things like Parcheesi, but other games in that ilk. And we noticed that many of them had pieces made of stone. And these are games from the 1600s and 1700s. And we also noticed that the boards were usually could be made of stone or wood. And we knew that we could not do that. That is too expensive. And then we started finding, as you got into the northern reaches of India, we started finding cloth boards because they were easy to pack. I mean, there are a lot of people who are living nomadic lifestyles. If they're going to have a game with them, they're going to want to be able to store it in a small bag or in a mat they could roll up. And in fact, a very common form of games is a rolled up mat. And then for the game pieces, you just use stones or acorns or whatever, like seeds, whatever small piece you might have nearby. As soon as we realized this, we thought, this is something that we can package. So when we were designing the production of Premiere, we found a company in China that made cloth playmats, cloth table mats, basically, and had them print out the map of Pamir. And for the pieces in Pamir, we wanted something that felt like stone. So we decided to look at resin. Resin can be a lot of things, but it tends to be heavier than a plastic. and you can adjust the chemical composition of resin. And so by lowering the amount of silicone in the resin, it creates a chalkier, more brittle feel, which feels a little bit like a stone. Whereas if you have a higher amount of silicone in the resin, it's going to be a little bit not rubbery, but smoother. And that didn't feel like quite, we didn't want them to feel like erasers. And so that's an instance of like an aesthetic strategy and a consideration for the physical object, or rather that's a situation where the consideration for a physical object becomes part of an aesthetic strategy. Now, the governing aesthetic strategy, and I know I'm going kind of quickly, the governing aesthetic strategy for all these games is something they also sometimes think it's something that sometimes it's called deco-rationalism. Now, deco-rationalism is a theory, an aesthetic theory that basically says the objects as they exist should make sense within the context of their own existence, which is a little circular. But basically what that means is if two characters in a Star Wars movie are playing a game of chess, it should look like space Star Wars. It should seem like, or it should look like Star Wars chess. It should look like space chess. It shouldn't look like a European chess set. Because what you want, ideally, is the objects in the world to look like they belong there. Now that goes for games as well. So a lot of times when we build games, we want to design a game that looks like it would make sense within the world of its own designing. And Root is a good example of that. We considered very early on in the development of Root having miniatures instead of the wooden pieces that exist now. But the biggest reason we didn't want the miniatures is because miniatures always look a little bit like a video game. And some of that is the fact that when we think about our interaction with 3D sculpting, we're going to see that interaction in mobile games, in just the games that we play. That's where 3D sculpting lives in our own minds, and then also in movies. Those are two things that we don't want people. I don't want people thinking about flipping Fortnite when they sit down to play a game of Root. I want them thinking about the world of Root. And in order to do that, I have to not use the tools of digital game design in the space of tabletop game design. So we decided to use meeples. Now, when we were looking at those wooden pieces, one rule that we realized very early on is that if we wanted it to look like it belonged in the world of Root, they had to be a little rudimentary, a little abstract. Because if they were carefully cut, beautifully built wooden pieces, they would look like modern board games. They wouldn't look like an object that would exist within the woodland. And so Kyle designed those kind of like simple, now sort of iconic, like cat shape and the very simple screen printing. When we went to do Oath, we even took that a step farther, and all the Oath player pieces look very abstract, and they have a very kind of like chessy kind of vibe. I don't really know how else to say that. Okay, so finally, I want to talk a little bit about development. So once a game has been greenlit, which basically means that we have an aesthetic strategy, we have team buy-in, and we have a working proof of concept. Then we have to figure out how long it's going to take, and we have to go into the process of development. Now, development basically has two phases. The first phase of development is to make sure that every single element of the game is as interesting, as expressive as it can possibly be. Now, I use expressive here very specifically, because one way of thinking about a game is thinking about a game as a kind of language. A game design presents its players with nouns and verbs that they can use to assemble stories. And so when I talk about expressiveness in a game, what I'm interested in is, well, what kind of poetry can you write using this game? What sort of verbs are you getting access to? What sort of nouns? If I find yourself just, you keep writing the same dang poem about the red wheelbarrow over and over and over again, maybe the core language of the game isn't as expressive enough, isn't as expressive as it needs to be. So the first stage of development is, let's make sure the players have every tool they could possibly use. Now, the second stage of development, and that can last for years, by the way, it can last months and months and months. And usually during this period, we are working on the graphics, working on the production. We are playing the game 2 or 3 times a week. And at a certain point, we realize that the game is expressive enough, and then it is time to sort of close up development, which enters the second stage of development. The second stage of development is primarily focused on limiting design liability. So if the goal of the first wave of development is to make the game as interesting as possible, The goal of the second wave of development is to make sure the game doesn't break. And that seems maybe like a little trite, but it's quite important, because every time you make a change in the second stage of development, the primary thing that I'm worried about is, did this change, which made the game better, did it break something else? And so this process tends to be very closely aligned with the work of editors and with the work of playtesters who are interested in finding exploits and bugs in the core system. Now, in order to do this in practice, this means that in the second stage of development, we do a lot of digital playtesting. This was something that we started doing during the COVID pandemic, where we had to move all of our playtesting digitally anyway. And we found that there was usually when we were planning playtesters, when we were planning a playtesting schedule, playtesters always exhaust themselves. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just the nature of how things go. And so when I would build these development schedules, I would build like a little chart, like little heats. And I would say, oh, this is a really good group. They love playtesting in the early stages and things are a little rougher, but I know they're going to wear out after 5 plays. So once they wear out, I'm going to put in the second group, and then they're going to be in for a little bit, and then they're going to wear out, and I'll put it in this third group. And you kind of build a chart that's going to take you all the way to the completion of the project. What we found, which is to say, I'm just going to underline this point, playtesting is exhausting and it's high attrition. Now, what we found was when we went, first of all, why is that the case? Well, the primary reason it's the case is that every time I change a game, that poor playtester needs to go to FedEx and print a new copy of the game. They need to assemble it. They need to find a group of friends, and maybe their friends are now sick of that game, and they need to convince them to come over to their house on Saturday night and play it. So we would usually release a playtesting kit on Monday to give our playtest leads a whole week to get everything set up. Maybe they give us feedback on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then Monday we can put in those changes and release the new kit. If we iterate once every week, we're lucky. Often in traditional playtesting, we are iterating once every 2 weeks or even 3 weeks, which is a pretty slow iterative loop. So how did the COVID pandemic change all that? Well, we started using a platform called Tabletop Simulator. Tabletop Simulator allows us to have essentially one centralized digital playtesting kit. It's actually a lot like software management. And when I want to make a change to that kit, I just make it and I push it out. And what we found is that we would push our kits, because nobody needed time to make a kit and most people were playing on the weekends. On Thursdays or Friday mornings, we would push out the kit to our testers, and we organize all of our testing through Discord. When we pushed the kit out, we would have patch notes. And what we found was that instead of exhausting our playtesters, actually it excited them. We started getting more and more and more testers every week, because as the game was getting closer to completion, it was more fun to play, and people wanted to sort of be where the action was. They wanted to participate in it. And so we found that our testing discords were getting larger and larger with every passing week and not smaller. This allowed us to perform a level of testing that was never possible in physical kits. So Oath received, for instance, 3-4 times as much testing as Root easily. And certainly our upcoming game Arcs has received about that much testing as well. So now to kind of dial us back into the production schedule, and then I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. After all this testing, we eventually get to the production stage of game development. In this stage, we finish the files and get them to our graphic designers. The graphic designers have been working on the project the whole way through, but building a file to be printed on a home printer is fundamentally different than building a file to be printed with offset printing in a big factory in China. And so it takes about 2 to 3 months to rebuild all the game assets to factory spec and to get all that stuff ready. During that time, we send files to the factory and they offer us notes. And these notes, it would be difficult to explain how carefully these files are assembled, because there are so many odd things that happen deep in the inner workings of a PDF that have to be corrected for to stop really severe errors from happening. This includes things like making sure all of your blacks are the same color of black, which is a lot harder than it might seem like it would be. Color correction and color management usually takes 3 weeks to handle all that stuff. Getting all of the precise kerning and paragraph composition on the text is like another 2 or 3 weeks. It's a lot of work. Once that's done, the game goes into production. We use mostly factories in China, but there are game factories in Europe, some coming in India, and there are some in the United States too. Although the United States game factories, which are really exceptional, really only do card games. So if you've ever played with a bicycle deck of cards, those are almost certainly made by the American card game company. I think they're printed in North Carolina. There are other card game companies that work out of Michigan. Some of the best cards that are produced in the world are produced in the United States. But outside of that, if I wanted a factory in the United States to print a wooden componentry, it would cost 10 times as much as in China. So a lot of the best technology for plastics production and wood production is in the north of China, and then increasingly in India, and then there is some in Germany. But again, I could talk about production stuff all day. Game production takes about 3 months, but it depends heavily on the quantity being produced and the type of project. If we were just producing a card game with maybe 100 cards in it, a little box, that's not going to take as long as Oath, for sure. Then it hops on a boat. We get it over here. We put it through fulfillment. So we are largely supported by crowdfunding. And I could talk for hours and hours and hours about business plans and crowdfunding stuff, but I'll save that for questions. And after that, we gradually move the game into a retail release schedule, usually about 3 to 6 months after backers get it. And around that time, we just wait for reviews. And what we're looking for any title at Leader Games is a sustaining audience. So if we don't need every game to be as successful as Root has been, but what we do want to see is around 5,000 people who seem to really love the game and can support future endeavors, both within that game line and in adjacent lines. So that's what we're always hitting for. And this is the reason why I want to end on this point is this is a fundamentally different approach to publishing than you see in a lot of other industries, and even within the game industry. Most game companies are designed around the idea that they want a big hit. They're looking for a game like Root. They're looking for a game like Wingspan. They want a massive, massive hit. We are not built like that at all. We are looking for a small dedicated audiences that can sustain the investigation that we do into our weird brand of tabletop games. If a game finds that audience, it's a massive, massive success. So some games that I've worked on that you probably haven't heard of, things like Fort or even Ahoy. Ahoy's our pirate game. Fort is a small card game. They have great sustaining audiences. Those games are in print. They're selling very well. They're not going to fund the entire company by themselves, but they do fund the creative teams that built them and have allowed us to continue investigating games like that. So hope this gives you kind of an overview of all the game design practice stuff. And I'm happy to take whatever questions you might have.
What made you want to choose the specific representation of the different medieval factions, animals?
That's a great question. So I'm going to restate it to make sure that I heard it. You want to know a little bit about why the specific. So are you interested in why the specific animal pairings or why animals in general?
I guess both.
Okay, excellent. So Root had a kind of an interesting backstory. So basically, Patrick had designed this asymmetric adventure game called Vast. And he really wanted there to be an asymmetric strategy game. Now, an asymmetric game is just a game where the players have very different player positions. And he asked me if I'd be interested in working on this problem. And I had been thinking a lot about what it would take to design an approachable war game. I adore historical games and war games. I spent last evening, I was playing a Waterloo game with my brother. So this is the air, the water that I swim in. I was very interested in this as a design puzzle. And so I had built a game called Rule, which was just a generic medieval strategy game that used a lot of the same rules that are in Root. And as I was working on it, what we found was that the game was pretty mean. It was pretty odd, and we didn't quite know how to sell it. And there was a funny thing that happened at the company, which is we had at that time another person working on a science fiction game, and then we had another person working on a fantasy game. And so Patrick liked my game over the other two and said, okay, well, we want to do what Cole's working on, but we don't know how to set it. Now, Kyle had been drawing all of these kind of like adorable animals with halberds and things. Because he was just doodling. And Kyle said, actually, I think that we should give it a kind of Redwall theme. We should have this kind of animal world. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I think it actually can solve a problem with the game. So there was a funny thing, because initially it was kind of like we chose it almost arbitrarily, but actually the interesting question is not why we chose it, but why we stuck with it, which is what we found was that by giving the game a cartoon aesthetic, the game mechanisms could be a lot grimmer and a lot more direct. And so, early in my talk, I talked about Blood Rage, a game that is not very mean mechanically, but which presents itself very meanly. And what is happening there is that the game is trying to make you think you're playing something serious by dressing it up in serious clothes, not because the game's mechanisms are serious. With Root, it's the opposite. The game is doing something very serious and very mean and very hard, but in order to make it palatable, it's using its art to make it seem more approachable. And there was also a little bit of a marketing strategy present too, which was we had this sense that people love confrontational games. The vast majority of players, they want confrontation, which is funny because if you ask them, they will say, well, I don't like games when I'm mean. I absolutely don't like that. And yet the games that are the most popular, the ones that have endured for millennia, are very confrontational. And so as we were working on this, I had a conversation with Kyle where I said, I think at some point in game publishing, people decided that boys like confrontation and boys like guns and gore and blood and brawn. And they kind of dressed up confrontational games in these costumes. And that has estranged whole bodies of players that weren't, that had no idea that they could be interested in this style of game. And so after we, did the work of essentially making Root adorable, which it is, what we found is there were tons of people who would run up to us and say, I've never played a war game before in my life, but I adore this game. And I'm always trying to cajole my friends into playing it. And so, there was a marketing concern, but also there was a concern just about like the aesthetics of it. Now, the specific theming that we went through, basically I knew I wanted the game to engage in biopolitics and engage in basically the population of the people who live in the area. Now, if you've played a game like Risk, you know that the world is like only populated by fellow combatants. It's like very it's not an empty world, but it is it's kind of like very homogeneous. Everyone's a little Napoleonic soldier in a game of Risk. Or in other games like Monopoly, when you're playing Monopoly and going around the table starts empty. Players build it up. In Catan, the island is empty except for the initial settlements. With Root, I wanted the world to be populated. And so the animals gave us a shorthand for creating different interest groups. So we have, foxes and mice and rabbits who are meant actually as, small herbivore, like we wanted different classes. Like we had like the lower class, the kind of middle class, and a kind of predatory militaristic class that are just sort of existing inside the woodland. And then the player factions route those characters through their own political calculus, basically, right? So, for example, the Marquis, which are the cats because they're not native to a woodland, they're civilizing, they're domesticated, they're domesticated and domesticating in the context of the game. They go through cards, they spend cards, they are interested in courting local favor and then immediately using it for extra actions to craft things like that. Whereas the Erie, who are the older rulers, a kind of more ancient order, who are a much more stratified society, when they get access to the local population, they lock them in a decree. So they're interested in a kind of caste, a kind of order that is going to then propel their political fortunes. And in all of these cases, the use of animals was as a convenient mechanical and allegorical shorthand, right? People know that like badgers are big and tough. And that's really all I want you to know about a badger when we're going to like invoke that faction, right? Or the Lord of the Hundreds, which is a kind of warrior, kind of Genghis Khan style faction. they're rats, right? And here we're both tapping on, rats as critters, but more importantly, the mythology of rats. And that taps to recent work, but also going far. I mean, back to the Piper, really. And so whenever we're working on games, we always build pretty exhaustive mood boards, because I don't think that when we go to create a game world that we're ever creating in isolation. We are always interfacing with existing systems of symbol, mythology, and story. And so the games that have done what best for us are the ones that resonate with those existing systems.
I have a question more on the physicality side of things. So I'm prototyping a game. It's more card driven, but we are thinking of having a board to kind of help keep track of things.
Mm-hmm.
How would you go about sizing such a thing?
Oh, it's a great question. Depends on what you're keeping track of. I mean, so for instance, let me contrast two very simple. This is, if I were teaching a game design class, I'd start with this puzzle. Let's imagine you have a game where players have money. There are two choices. You could have coins, right? You could have punchboard coins or paper money, or you could have a money track. Now, a money track, let's say it's 0 to 20 or something. And as you spend money, you're going to move a pawn down a track to track your money. And that is in contrast with, if I have 20 coins, I grab, 2 5s and maybe 5 1s or something, or 3 5s and 5 1s. Now, how are those different? Well, from a prototyping standpoint, the punchboard pieces are going to be way more time intensive. A track is easy. You just make a table and then you number it. That's not going to take very much time at all. But if you want players to understand where the money is coming from and to really feel it as they spend it, you want it as an isolated resource. Also, tracks get knocked all the time, right? And so it's a little bit harder to see how much money players have. If you're looking across the table at a track, you can get around that if you have a central track, right? A lot of times when I'm starting working on a prototype, especially a prototype that has a lot of resources on it, I will default to tracks. And in terms of determining size of board and things like that, I use 15 millimeter squares. So, I'll make in Illustrator a little box that's 15 millimeter square, and I'll use that for tracks, because a 10 millimeter cube is going to sit on that with a lot of, a fair bit of padding on the sides. There are other ways to do tracks too. For instance, you could have a single number line that's number, let's say 0 to 6. And then every player has a different resource token. So I've got my wheat token, it's at 3, which means I have 3 wheat. I have a brick token, it's at 5, it has 5 wheat, things like that. But when you have physical resources, different options open up. So for example, if your game concerns storage, you want physical objects, because then you could say, look, you've got 5 resource slots, and 3 of them are taken up by wheat and 2 of them are taken up by bricks, and you're full. That can be a hard thing to show with just tracks. In terms of board size, I usually recommend, almost as a global rule, if you're working on a board game, start with a 4-panel board, 4 landscape pieces of letter. And as you start going, we say okay, well, in this game, we need to track 10 resources. Just put those cubes on that letter sheet and just kind of block it out. Even before you do any graphic design, just take the paper and a pencil and just draw rough squares. You can even do it as a little thumbnail. It's funny, a lot of I've been a professional graphic designer for many, many years now. And so much of my work, I feel happens in a thumbnail, where I clean my desk, so I don't have any here, but I'll draw a little inch square and then just try to draw the board, because I kind of want to see what it looks like from a distance. And also I can do a lot of composition work at a small scale. And because there's no reason for me to create a file and start actually laying things out until I have a broad sense of how things are gonna go. Last thing I'll say about tracks, other ideas for tracks. You could also use dials. Dials are really can be very effective, especially if you want your tracks to correspond to different things. So let's say if you have 5 towns, you make a tax revenue of 2 coins per turn. You can put that 5 and that 2 on a wheel, and then just use one of those like little copper pins to pin the wheel, and then you can scoot the wheel around so players can see how much they have, and then any consequence in the wedge of the wheel that's cut out. We used a lot of these for a Vast and Mysterious Manor, where the previous version of the first edition of Vast, or sorry, the first game in the Vast series, Vast the Crystal Caverns, used a lot of tracks. And what we found was that it was a little just hard to see. I'd like look at my track and not really know what I was looking at. And so we switched to dials for all the character stats, and it worked pretty well.
I think you managed to cover so much ground that we.
Oh yeah, well, I went pretty fast.
You did. I mean, you covered an awful lot, and yeah, a lot on the production side. And dials, the sort of, I always get slightly mystified when I open the game. Things, which way up am I supposed to put it through the middle? It takes me a while to work it out.
Yes.
But dials are kind of, they give you that something which is also, I guess, in your own space. And
well, one thing that I'll add, because I know that y'all are thinking about history games and wargaming, and how like the process of forming things into games. One thing I didn't talk about, which is probably worth mentioning, is like a kind of universal formula for thinking about any game that is on a historical topic. And I could give a whole talk about this, and I have in the past, but I will say briefly that if you're working on a historical topic, you basically only need to answer 2 questions. But these are the sorts of questions that you have to keep answering. So it's not the kind of thing that you answer and then you move on to page 2 of the worksheet. And those 2 questions are, in your period that you're studying, in your topic, whatever it might be that you're studying or gaming or whatever, which actors exercised agency? Who had power? Who was making decisions? The sort of decisions that you might want a player to be making. Now, again, this sounds like a very simple question, but it can be quite difficult. So, for example, in the case of Pax Pamir, which is a game about state formation in Afghanistan in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, the question of who had power is actually really intriguing. And it took a lot of reading for me to realize that it wasn't single actors. In Pax Pamir, you do not play a particular chieftain or a particular prince or a particular European spy. Instead, a lot of the action, a lot of the true agency was being exercised by cabals and political factions who were loosely associated like alliances. We call these like coalitions. And the players are like networks. They're like actor networks that are then forming coalitions. So that's the first question. Who's exercising power? And then the second question, and this is the really important one, is what did they care about? And you use the answer to that second question to determine what your victory points should be. So in Pamir, they cared about forming a stable Afghan state and then having the political wherewithal to command and control the state after its formation. And so those rules, so critically, they didn't care about killing everyone. There was no winning scenario where you kill everyone and win. That wasn't the primary motivator. And that's very different from Risk. I mean, think about Risk, for instance. I always pick on it, but it's a brilliant game. But like in Risk, you care about controlling the entire world, and like not even the most depraved dictator wants that. So it produces very weird sets of incentives. And I think, I'll use another example. In Monopoly, you play landlords. Okay, so you're going to make a game about, we'll call it the 20th century city, and you want the primary actors with a lot of power, to be essentially Donald Trump style, like real estate developers. Okay, I buy that. That if I'm going to tell a game about the history of a city and I want to make the primary actors real estate developers, that is a way that one can make a game. But here's where Monopoly loses me. In Monopoly, you care about one thing, which is wealth and value. At the end of the game, you don't even care about that. You care about the elimination of all rivals in Monopoly. That's the one thing that you're trying to do. You're not trying to become rich. You're trying to be the last person standing. You want to immiserate your competition. And that's not quite right. I think that rich people probably care a lot more about which country clubs they join than immiserating their rivals. But Monopoly has no framework for doing that. There's a game published by a Dutch company called Splotter, called Greed Incorporated. It was a game that was a beautiful design made after the financial crash. And in that game, you manage little businesses, and you were essentially like, you're almost doing like venture capital work. You invest in businesses, you build them up, you tear them down, all that stuff. But critically, the game is won by the player with the most status. And at the end of every turn, there's this auction where you compete for fancy cars, art objects, or whatever. And it's the best game about the American upper class I've ever played, because it understands that money is a tool to advance status. And so it's an economic game with this kind of like little twist that animates everything. So again, when you're working on historic games, it's always important. And this is true at the start of a project, and it's true if you're halfway through your project. It's true if you're at the end of your project. In your period, who are the players who are the characters that have any kind of agency? And then what do they really care about? What are the things that are animating them? And if you can make your game design align with the answers to those two questions, it's going to resonate with the actual period that you're hoping to make your game about.
I think we run dry of questions. Thank you so much.
It's absolutely my pleasure. I will say broadly, if anyone has any further questions, if they want to get in touch with me, you can find me at Cole@Whirligig or Cole@leadergames.com. Either email will work. I'm also on Twitter for a while longer. We'll see. And my brother and I's next project is launching today in 30 minutes. And it is hopefully an interesting example of some of the ideas I've talked about today. Our next game is called Molly House. It's about queer history in the early 18th century. And it's an interesting design that tries to talk about the formation of underground communities and urban spaces in the early modern period. It's also about the history of policing and a lot of the concerns of aesthetics, game design, agency, objectives that I talked about today. You could see at work in that design.
Well, thank you so much for joining us and giving up time with us this morning. It's been wonderful to have you with us, and we'll let you go launch your next project.
Yes.
Well, within the next 30 minutes or so.
Yeah, I appreciate the distraction from just worrying about it. So it's my pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Well, thank you once again. We will let you go.
All right, excellent.